Hello again, everyone. Tom Nagorski with the Cipher Brief. Here today for a conversation about Afghanistan, a country that was for a very long time at the top of the list for national security concerns for the United States. It's dropped off a little since the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan in 2021. Recently, Dave Pitts, a former assistant director of CIA for South and Central Asia, and a person who spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, wrote a piece for the Cipher Brief, a powerful piece that basically made the case, don't forget Afghanistan. It was a collection, among other things, of policy recommendations for the Trump administration as it returned to office in terms of dealing with Afghanistan. And Dave Pitts joins us now. Dave, it's great to see you again. It's great to be with you. I know for a whole host of reasons, you care deeply about that country and therefore about U.S. policy towards Afghanistan. And I want to start with something that was at the top, I think, of your list of 5 policy recommendations for the White House, which was state clearly that Afghanistan remains important to the United States. First of all, why does Afghanistan remain important to the United States in your view?
Well, good morning, Tom. Thanks for having me in for this discussion. And if I could just segue a little bit to something you said earlier, we all used to see Afghanistan in the headlines for a long period of time leading up to 21, and then for some period of time after that. That wasn't always good, but it was certainly out there in front of everyone. So now we don't see a lot about Afghanistan. Certainly there are many other pressing national security priorities in front of the United States, and we have to deal with all of them. So the challenge, I think, for this new administration and for people who are trying to support not the Afghans who are still in Afghanistan and those who are in exile and those who are trying to become resettled in the United States, is how do you keep this issue on sort of a, if not the front burner, one right behind it for the new administration. So as new policies start to get shaped and decisions are being made, that Afghanistan is in that mix in an appropriate way. I think that's one of the challenges. A couple of things about why Afghanistan matters. The first thing I would say, and this is, I think, true for a lot of Americans. I mean, we're there for 2 decades, and it's hard to find someone who either wasn't there or not, doesn't know someone who was there or wasn't affected maybe by the 2 decades we had there. So I think for a lot of Americans, they see this as unfinished business, right? We left abruptly and in a chaotic way. We didn't achieve the goals necessarily. We did achieve some major goals against Al Qaeda, but we had a number of other things we were trying to pursue with Afghanistan, and along with thousands of our Afghan colleagues. So I think one thing that shows why this is still important is we have unfinished business there. The second thing is clearly in our national interest. Terrorism didn't go away quietly. As I said in some previous article, we still have to be concerned about ISIS-K. Al Qaeda is trying to resurge in Afghanistan because it's been a partner to the Taliban for a long time. And so now it isn't under any pressure from the United States or the West or any security service in Afghanistan. The potential for, so terrorism, the threat of terrorism is really high. The potential for regional instability is high, with that instability sort of coming across the borders from Afghanistan. I mean, if you think about this region, this is the region where we have the China-India border. It's where we have the India-Pakistan border. It has Iran, it has Russia, it has China. So it has a number of adversaries and partners vital to our long-term national security interest. That's the other reason it's important. And we have, these emerging partnerships in Central Asia that are also important to the United States. And those Central Asian partners are very concerned about what's going on in Afghanistan and the threats of terrorism that might come across their border, the potential for recruitment that might come across their border. So we have a lot of interest there. And I think we have partners who are hoping we will determine that we have unfinished business there and work with them to put Afghanistan on a political path for the future that benefits everybody.
So let me put a lot on the table there, and maybe I could follow up on them in the
Sure.
order you mentioned them, Dave. One was the resettlement of Afghans who worked with the United States, and it's very often a great risk to themselves. You write in the piece for us about the reputational issue for the United States, that we are a country that keeps its commitments. As you know, in the early days of the Trump administration, that pipeline, I'm not really clear where it is right now, but it's been cut off, I believe, for Afghans who had already been vetted and were cleared to come. Is that your understanding, and how damaging is that to the things you're talking about here?
Yeah, it's a good question, Tom, and I think where this is the administration is making these really large moves on issues such as immigration, and I think
Hmm.
the one result of that was that captured all of the Afghans who were already in the SIV process and a lot of other sort of legitimate efforts to get here to the United States and resettle. I don't. It's not my read that Afghans were specifically targeted in those orders. So maybe I'm a little too optimistic here, but what I hope is that as the dust starts to settle on this and they start, you know, determining which groups that those executive orders did not apply to, the Afghans will be back in a good place on
Right.
traveling to and resettling in the United States.
And on the terrorism front,
Yeah.
the Biden administration, in its, I think, safe to say, fraught departure withdrawal in 2021, President Biden said right around that time that the terrorism issue could be dealt with in a phrase, over the horizon, meaning you didn't have to have boots on the ground, you didn't have to have the presence there to deal with the threat of ISIS-K and the other groups that are operating there. Do you think that's a sustainable policy in terms of dealing with the threat? And if not, what else can be done, particularly since you also don't believe the United States should be involved with the Taliban, really?
Uh, if over the horizon is essentially all you have, then you have to speak to the positives related to over the horizon, and you have to try to make that work. So, that's what our colleagues and in the U.S. military and Department of Defense are trying to do. How do we get the most that we can out of over the horizon capability? And over the horizon doesn't just mean kinetic capability. It means we can collect information, even though we're
Hmm.
sitting here and that country is there. And so the idea is, yes, we're going to do some of that, and we'll have some successes with over the horizon. But I personally don't see it as a sustainable long-term approach for dealing with terrorism in Afghanistan. And I think there's some of my professional colleagues who would agree with that. If that's all you have,
Hmm.
you're gonna lean into that hard and make it work. You're gonna work with your partners to make sure you can collect as much information as you can to sort of fuel an over-the-horizon system. But there are a lot of challenges there. And the other side of that coin is we can't leave our national security interest on terrorism in the hands of the Taliban. They're not capable, or they're not willing to take some of the steps they need to take. Particularly against Al Qaeda, they're not willing to do some of the things we'd like to see them do. And quite frankly, Al Qaeda's full posture inside of Afghanistan and what they really look like now is a little bit fuzzy, I think, for a lot of people. And I think they have just a lack of capability to deal effectively with ISIS-K. So we can't leave this in their hands. And look, I think we've got some willing partners who are happy to work with us on this, as they did when we were there, but they have limitations. So when we're not there, I think that also limits some of their effectiveness as well.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
Dave, let me pick up with a question about the Taliban. You've mentioned them a couple of times. You warned in the piece you wrote for us about what you called the slippery slope of recognition, that the United States might someday recognize the Taliban. Even if they didn't, a lot of other countries are doing so. Is it possible for the U.S. to have influence in any way in Afghanistan without recognizing or engaging with the Taliban?
Yes, it's possible to have influence in Afghanistan without recognizing the Taliban, but I would say that's a complex question with a complex solution.
Yeah.
But I would say we don't have much currently. We just don't. I mean, look, we don't, and the United Nations doesn't, and you see that the Taliban really likes to call the shots. Um, it also likes to deal with countries individually, not with a group of countries, where it can offer its own, access to its resources or specific issues about border security or other things to entice a more open relationship with some of those countries, particularly some of the neighbors. You've got countries that are taking a look at that. In some cases, for instance, China wants to have its own relationship with, or a better relationship with the Taliban so it can manage sort of its own issue with the Uyghurs. It doesn't want Afghanistan to sort of fall back into the sphere of being a partner to the United States. It doesn't like that, the presence and influence of the United States that close to what it considers its neighborhood. It's certainly looking for minerals and other resources. And I think it wants to keep Afghanistan in a place where it has its say and influence, and we're out and we're pushed out. So each of those countries in the region, I mean, some countries might make an arrangement with the Taliban just because of legitimate border concerns. Like, you are there, so we have to deal with you. Let's talk about a way to secure our border. I think that's true of what's going on in Central Asia. I would say I just want to go back to China too, because one of the things China is very interested in is using Afghanistan for its Belt and Road Initiative, getting access into Central Asia. So there's also some economic opportunities and influence opportunities running through Afghanistan for China. So it's got a lot of reasons. I think for us, we have rightly said we don't recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government in Afghanistan. Most countries have said that. We're unwilling to sort of give in, to move forward off that line with the Taliban. They are unwilling to make any concessions to the United States and the international community on a whole host of issues. The one that stands out most to everyone is education for women and girls. Of course, we see the Taliban also skimming off money that goes in for humanitarian aid. So there's a lot of things that where we disagree with the Taliban, and we don't seem to have the influence to make them change their behavior. And so it's one of the things I recommended, and other people have talked about, is, look, you've got to have both stick and carrot, but you really got to have an organized international effort to this, where everyone is on the same page in how we're dealing with the Taliban. And we need that enabled, legitimate political opposition to the Taliban that can also speak on behalf of Afghans everywhere.
Well, you've gone right to what was going to be my next question, Dave, which is this notion of the U.S. helping or encouraging the emergence of a legitimate opposition to the Taliban. Again, kind of same question. How do you do that when you're far away, as the United States is?
Yeah, look, so though the legitimate political opposition, some of them are in the United States, and they're in Europe, and they're in Australia. They're all over the world. I mean, then they're in exile, actually. And many of them are just our former colleagues. These are people who were government officials. They were civil society. They were private sector. They were humanitarian organizations. They were educational institutions across, the full spectrum of that in Afghanistan. And then they have all had to leave the country. Well, they are still the experts we need to talk to on Afghanistan. What is really going on in Afghanistan? What can we do to improve the future of Afghanistan? And it's been to our detriment that we have not engaged them in a conversation about the future of Afghanistan since we left, since we withdrew. And so so we and the United Nations, other countries, are trying to talk to the Taliban about the future of Afghanistan, and the Taliban want to talk about the survival of their regime. So we're not even having the same conversation when we get in a room together. The people who I think represent the needs and the views and the interest of Afghans in Afghanistan and those around the world are our colleagues now who are dispersed. Now, we can't have can't talk to 10,000 or 100,000 people. So we do need our Afghan colleagues to consult, and we do need a small group to emerge that can represent their interests. That's a big challenge. I get it. But we need that to happen. So there's a group that can talk here in Washington, that can talk in London, that can talk across Europe, that can talk in New York at the United Nations, and that can talk to the Taliban about the future. I think that is part of the political path that we need to put in place.
So last question for you, Dave. You've got 15 minutes, maybe less, in the Oval Office or at the State Department with Marco Rubio. And back to where you started, you want to make the case. Don't forget Afghanistan. What's your pitch?
My pitch is, you're busy. Take my paper I wrote for Cipher Brief and have a quick read. I think it's all in there. I'm not shortcutting your answer here, but I think I tried to, what I wrote, I tried to write it not in an emotional way. We can't just make it an emotional issue, and it is for a lot of people, and for good reason. And And we can't make it an issue where everyone is angry about where we are. So it can't be an issue where we're trying to force something with a lot of anger. I think we have to approach it in a practical way. What's best for our interest as the United States? And part of that is sticking to our commitments when we make it with our partners. And part of that is looking after our interest in foreign parts of the world, and even recognizing mistakes that have been made and moving forward with a new policy that can correct some of our past failures. I think there's opportunity to do that now. And I also think this isn't about sending billions of dollars anywhere or sending troops. This is a modest investment, I think, in diplomacy and some recognition with of a legitimate political opposition. So I think this certainly fits. It isn't going to be the most time-consuming thing that Washington has to do, but it certainly will be productive.
Well said. And you did it in way less than 15 minutes.
Yeah, there you go.
Dave Pitts, always great to talk to you, and really, really appreciate your passion and also your comments about Afghanistan. And thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Tom. Thanks.